Hello, everyone. I think we're just about ready to get started. Welcome to Solar Alberta's 2022 seminar series. Today's webinar is called Solar Siting Best Practices, Where to Locate Solar Installations. My name is Megan Sitch, and I am the Public Outreach Assistant for Solar Alberta, not for all of Alberta. I would like to take a minute to acknowledge that I am presenting to you today from Amiskwichi-Waskahegan, also known as Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which is located on Treaty 6 territory and the homelands of the Métis Nation. Treaty 6 territory is the traditional gathering place and home of many Indigenous peoples, including the Pappas Chase, Nihawer Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Blackfoot, and Nakota Sioux, nations whose ancestors have cared for and nurtured these lands since time immemorial. We're delighted to have so many people register for this event. Please note that we will be recording this webinar for future distribution. Today, we will be hearing from two informative speakers about the importance of being thoughtful and intentional when choosing where to install a solar installation. Following the presentations, there will be a Q&A period in which you can all participate. The formal Q&A will run until about 1/4 past the hour, and then we will be inviting you to join us for an additional 15 minutes in a more relaxed Zoom meeting. The link for the extended Q&A will be posted in the chat at the end of the formal Q&A, and I will draw your attention to it at that time. So please make sure to click on the link before leaving the webinar. In an effort to increase accessibility to the content we are offering, we have enabled closed captioning for this presentation. You can turn the closed captioning on in the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. During our formal Q&A period, we will be using Zoom Q&A for questions rather than the chat box, so please enter your questions in the Q&A section. Also, please click on the little thumbs up symbols to upvote questions you like. Before we move forward, we are going to do a quick poll to get a sense of who we have joining us today. Please take a minute to answer the question popping up on your screen now. And while some are still doing the poll, I encourage you to also take a minute and pop your name, land acknowledgement, and any contact info you are comfortable sharing in the chat now and throughout the event so that others can look you up on LinkedIn or email you, and some relationships can begin to be formed. Wonderful. There are all the poll results. So great to see all of you here. Thank you very much for participating. It's always helpful to know a little bit about the audience before we dive in. Now for a little bit about Solar Alberta. We are now in our 31st year of operation. We are a not-for-profit society that is dedicated to accelerating Alberta's transition to a just and sustainable energy future. We do so by advocating, educating, and serving as an industry and community hub for solar energy. Our membership is made up of over 320 individuals and businesses. We provide a number of services, including managing a solar directory through our website. In this way, we act as a bridge for installers, suppliers, and other solar-related businesses to connect with their customers and clients. You can see a screenshot of the directory here on this slide. In addition to our website services, we run a number of educational programs, such as this solar seminar series on a number of Thursdays over the lunch hour throughout the year, as well as a new multilingual Solar 101 workshops. We also host an annual online conference and trade show called the Solar Show, and a couple of in-person networking and trade show events each year. We are very proud to share that in 2022, our solar show reached over 600 people. Recordings of 2021 and 2022 solar show sessions can be found on our website, solaralberta.ca, and please save February 6th through 10th for our 2023 solar show. This fall and winter, we are hosting a number of online courses for solar industry professionals or those transitioning into the sector. Classes will be on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The first class, The Economics of Grid-Tied Solar PV, will be starting in October. If you are unable to attend the live classes this fall or winter, you can alternatively purchase pre-recorded courses and workshops on our website. If you are not already, I would like to encourage you to join Solar Alberta as a member. We are constantly evolving member service offerings, some of which you can see listed on the screen. Individual membership is $35 and can be purchased at solaralberta.ca. If you are looking for additional ways to support the work that Solar Alberta is doing, please consider volunteering or donating. Many of you in attendance have already donated to Solar Alberta when registering for this event, and we wish to extend our sincere thanks for that. Please be aware that volunteers are eligible for free membership within Solar Alberta after committing 15 hours, and are also eligible for $100 off of a course each year. Volunteer opportunities consist of helping with communications, public education, advocacy, and more. We are excited to share our autumn online 50/50 fundraiser. The jackpot is already over $700 and we are just in our early days of selling. The proceeds from this 50/50 will go directly to sustaining and expanding activities such as our monthly seminars, like this one, and our annual solar show, as well as networking events and presentations around the province. To participate, you must be 18 or over and an Alberta resident. Ticket sales end on October 27th, 2022 at 11:59 p.m. The draw will be taking place on October 28th, 2022. And if you don't gamble, no problem. Consider making a donation to Solar Alberta instead. Come work with us and help celebrate a sustainable and just energy transition in Alberta. We are hiring an executive assistant. This will be a part-time remote position with occasional in-person events and presentations in the Calgary area. Apply with resume and cover letter by October 2nd at midnight. Applications without a cover letter will not be considered. I'd like to take this opportunity to encourage those of you who live or work in the Edmonton area to join the Smart, Sustainable, Resilient Infrastructure Association and us on October 13th for the Sustainable Building Networking and Trade Show we are hosting at NATE. This will be an in-person opportunity for you to mix and mingle with folks in the solar and sustainable building industries. This event is free to attend. However, we are selling trade show booths for $200. Trade show booths for the event are available to Solar Alberta and SSRIA members at a 10% discount. Stay tuned to our social media and newsletters to learn about when more events will be. We hope to be in person in Southern Alberta again in 2023, as we were in the spring of this year. I would like to take this opportunity to give a big thank you to the City of Calgary for sponsoring today's seminar. We are happy to have their support. We are always interested in developing more partnerships for our events. If you or your company want to work with us to educate the public about solar or solar-related technologies or opportunities, please don't hesitate to reach out. And now to introduce our wonderful speakers. Today you will hear from Adam Stoker, a sustainable infrastructure engineer at the City of Calgary. Adam has been working with energy efficient and sustainable buildings in Alberta since 2004. His background in mechanical engineering, project management, and green design allows him to offer a broad range of knowledge and expertise on sustainable design and environmental stewardship. Adam has worked on over 50 lead projects across Western Canada and has worked directly with designers, contractors, and building operators in all phases of the project delivery process. In his current role as a sustainable infrastructure engineer at the City of Calgary, he is championing climate change and sustainable design across a multitude of projects. In partnership with NMAX, Adam is leading the Community Solar Fund, which will see the implementation of solar systems on 25 community association buildings across Calgary this year. Adam will be joined by his coworker, Lewis Percy, corporate environmental specialist, during the Q&A portion of our seminar today. Our second speaker is our own Heather McKenzie. Heather McKenzie is the Executive Director of Solar Alberta, where she and her team, that's us, are working hard to accelerate Alberta's transition to a just and sustainable energy future. She is a seasoned leader, community organizer, and green business advocate. Prior to becoming the Executive Director of Solar Alberta, she worked as a government relations professional, ran her own business, and served as an elected trustee on the Edmonton Public School Board. She is in the midst of completing a master's in public administration, has a master's in international development, and has an undergraduate degrees in both sociology and history. She believes that investing in solar is a very concrete way that everyday Albertans can take meaningful action on climate change. Welcome all, and thank you for joining us today. I will now turn the mic over to Adam to begin our seminar.
Thanks, Megan. And I'm actually going to steal that mic from Adam because I'm going to go first today and he's going to follow me. Now then, I'm just going to share my screen with you all. Okay. Well, hello, and thanks very much for the introduction, Megan. As you heard, my name is Heather McKenzie, and I'm the Executive Director at Solar Alberta. I'm pleased to be presenting to you today about Solar Alberta's recently developed solar siting recommendations. I just want to also take a minute to acknowledge that I'm presenting from Amiskwaci, Waskahegan as well, and it's of course located on Treaty 6 territory and the homelands of the Métis Nation. So Solar Alberta recently shared 2 sets of solar siting recommendations on our website. One version is intended for solar project developers, and I saw a few of you on the line today. And the other version is intended for municipal and county planners or elected councillors. These recommendations have come about as a means of reducing what we call green on green tension in Alberta. We hear about instances across our province and around the world in which environmentally minded folks are opposed to solar developments because of a perception that they are at odds with other environmental considerations. This issue has been growing in importance as the scale and quantity of solar arrays has increased dramatically in recent years. When people focus on debating the issue of where to locate solar installations at great length, we risk slowing action on addressing climate change. And I suspect most of the folks in attendance today will agree that it is essential we act quickly to address the climate emergency. Therefore, we have developed these tools to help developers, municipalities, and counties optimize their solar generating capacity while minimizing their broader ecological footprint. In essence, these are to help us all get along. Solar Alberta is not the first organization to have developed solar siting recommendations, although we suspect we might be the first in Alberta. Please note that we have undertaken extensive research and referenced a number of other guidelines or recommendations in the drafting of our own Made in Alberta documents. Today, I'm going to give you an overview of the recommendations, and then I look forward to hearing from the City of Calgary next about some of the best practices they have followed in determining where to place their solar installations. The project developer recommendations are more extensive than those we have prepared for municipalities, and therefore I'll give a brief overview of some of their unique components before delving into the broader recommendations that relate to both solar developers and municipalities alike. To begin, for all solar developers, it is paramount that you comply with the regulations in the jurisdiction in which you are operating. In Alberta, for most home and business arrays, this means that you are in compliance with Alberta's microgeneration regulation. And for most community generation developers, this means being in compliance with Alberta's small scale generation regulations, unless you happen to also be using the microgen ones, as I know some do. For any grid-connected solar farm, also known as utility scale development, there are extensive studies that are needed and an ISO process that you'll have to go through to ensure you're in compliance. Additionally, each municipality will have their own land use expectations and licensing processes that you will need to go through. Solar Alberta has a number of consultants and installation companies listed in our website directory that you could approach for expertise about the various regulations in place wherever you plan to develop. We also have a handy recording of a recent webinar on our website and YouTube channel that will give you the ins and outs of Alberta's microgeneration regulation in particular. Another important consideration for solar project developers is both current and future solar access for your site. If there are tall buildings around your site currently or planned to surround your site in the future, these could impede your production of energy. And so you'll want to either consider alternative locations or ensure your system is mounted strategically enough that it won't be negatively impacted. This is particularly important for urban solar project development, as there is a very pressing need for our cities to build up rather than build out. Of course, one option for projects that are taking shape in the midst of a high-rise environment is for the high-rises themselves to integrate solar into their windows, siding, roofs, and railings. For rooftop developments in particular, it is important to consider the building orientation, roof design, and electrical infrastructure on site. Ideally, builders should follow NRCan's solar-ready building guidelines to ensure that the generating potential of their array is maximized. To complement this, Solar Alberta has made available a webinar on our YouTube channel about solar-ready design, in which we highlight the most important built form considerations. And actually, one of our board members will be presenting at BuildX on this very topic in October, if any of you are planning to attend that. As with the previous solar access consideration, when contemplating rooftop installations in particular, you'll want to ensure a shading assessment is completed. Solar Alberta has many rooftop solar installers within our membership, and most will incorporate this type of assessment into your initial quote process, as shading will ultimately impact the size and shape of the array needed to offset your on-site electricity use. Wind is also something your installer or builder should take into consideration. A site that is particularly windy may add extra wind load to the roof installation, which can affect the amount of ballast needed for an array. So of course, this is more of an issue in southern Alberta than it is up in the north, but I have to admit my neighborhood's been very windy lately as well. So definitely something to think about. Another helpful tool to use when thinking through wind and other siting considerations are the Alberta Infrastructure Solar Photovoltaic Guidelines. Now, the remaining slides, the remainder of my slides, there are just a few left, should be helpful regardless of whether you are a solar project developer or a municipality considering whether to approve land for a solar project in your region. It is important to realize that folks have both a legal and ethical imperative to consult with Indigenous peoples prior to siting a solar array. For more details about this legal requirement to consult and accommodate, you can tune into our January 2022 webinar about supporting and investing in Indigenous clean energy. Consultation and accommodation of Indigenous perspectives is important for a wide variety of reasons, including reconciliation, mitigating regulatory risk, abiding by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also in order to ensure that sacred spaces are respected. Many Indigenous communities and nations are leading the charge on the adoption of renewable energy technologies in Canada. So consultation and ideally meaningful engagement with them can also provide a wealth of information and expertise. In keeping with the consultation theme, Solar Alberta also recommends that developers and municipalities consult with local residents, environment groups, and land use planners before siting solar. Local community groups are very attuned to the potential impacts of developments in their region, and broad consultation will help ensure you are optimizing energy generation, aware of any potential social impacts of your development, and limiting the broader ecological footprint of the project. Additionally, before site selection, you should consult with local wire provider services like NMAX in Calgary's case, EPCOR if you're in Edmonton, ATCO or Fortis in rural Alberta, and there are many others in very specific locations, to ensure that there's hosting capacity for your array. When it comes to residential, commercial, or community generation, these wire providers will ultimately be the ones determining if your installation conforms to the provincial regulations. If you are unsure about how to engage with the various wire service providers, or you are transitioning from one service area to another, we actually have a new course on this very topic. To preserve ecosystems, there are three important things to consider when planning for a ground-mounted solar array. First, prioritize using brownfield land, such as landfills or other industry-contaminated lands, or previously developed lands like car parks. Those would all be sort of in the brownfield category, depending who's defining it. Secondly, avoid greenfields. So greenfields are typically previously undeveloped lands. You want to avoid wetlands and also avoid floodplains. If it is necessary to develop on previously undeveloped land, aim to preserve the ground cover, trees and other vegetation as much as possible. If plants must be removed, revegetate after with a pro-pollinator and native or local plants. Thirdly, avoid land with species at risk or that serves as a wildlife corridor. And if you must develop within a wildlife corridor, aim to limit or eliminate fencing. Yes, you may have to pay for someone to stay on site if you're not going to have fencing, but I think it's worth it for those critters. And last, but certainly not least, Solar Alberta recommends preserving good farmland when developing solar. The Canada Land Inventory is a useful tool which classifies land based on its capability for agriculture. It can be used to help assess if land is good for farming purposes. If it is necessary to develop on good farmland, consider locating sheep, herbs, cows, bees, and other plants and animals on the same land as the solar development. These flora and fauna will happily coexist alongside your solar array, and in some cases, the relationship can be very beneficial for all parties. Sheep, for example, can remove weeds from solar arrays far more efficiently and cost effectively than other mechanisms. And solar arrays can be an excellent way of retaining moisture in soil and protecting livestock from severe weather. This combined solar and food production approach is called agrivoltaics, and it's really growing in popularity around the world as folks realize the importance of ensuring food security while concurrently transforming our energy sectors. I'm a firm believer in ending my presentation with this photo whenever possible, because I love the sheep on it. And as such, I'm going to turn the mic over now to Adam with the City of Calgary to share some of their best practices, and look forward to chatting with you all in the Q&A after.
All right. Thank you, Heather. And I'll just flip on there. And hello to everyone joining us today for the presentations. I myself am joining the conversation today from the land where the Bow and the Elbow Rivers come together, the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And thanks for Solar Alberta for inviting us along to share some of our stories, specifically as they pertain to the question of solar siting. So I'm going to talk through 3 case studies today, and at 3 different scale of photovoltaic installation, and hopefully from those cover a wide range of considerations, pros, cons, successes, and lessons learned from our City of Calgary projects. So those 3 things I'd like to talk today about are our Shepherd Solar Park, located in the southeast corner of the city. Our Renfrew Solar Garden project, which has recently come to fruition right in the heart of our city near the TELUS Spark building just north of the Bow River in downtown. And a third project, which is actually a collection of a number of small projects, which is something that's been delivered in partnership with NMAX through the NMAX Community Solar Fund. So I wanted to touch on that as well today. So we'll start with the first one, the Shepherd Solar Park. So this was the City of Calgary's first major ground-mounted solar installation, and it's located at the Shepherd landfill directly adjacent to the Calgary composting facility. This project produces more than 5 million kilowatt hours annually. That's equivalent to powering 750 homes, and it was delivered with support from the Alberta Municipal Solar Program. For those looking for more details on the history of this project in specific, I'd encourage you to check out calgary.ca/solar, where we have links to describe this and other solar projects that have been delivered by the City of Calgary. This site, so as I mentioned, it's located adjacent to the Calgary Composting Center and on lands that have historically it's part of the Shepherd landfill. And this is the first thing that I wanted to highlight about this project when it comes to siting, is that this is an example of a brownfield development. Development within the boundaries of a waste management facility and actually beyond the boundaries to a certain amount of setback is limited. So what we can physically build in urban areas near or at these locations is significantly limited, but photovoltaic systems are something that are a great fit. So we took advantage of this in this project to leverage underutilized land to start generating energy to feed this facility. And it's really interesting because of their nature. It's often something that can be done in conjunction or concurrently with remediation activities happening at site. So where you have long-term remediation happening at the site, it's not necessarily prohibited to bring solar to those locations. This is an aerial view of the site looking down, and actually what you saw in the previous image is just the northernmost portion of this project, and you can see it there in the center kind of stretching further as it was expanded over subsequent phases of development. I wanted to note that we were privileged to have a site that had fantastic solar access. So there's not much around in this case, which made it prime real estate for solar development. And I wanted to highlight that solar is a really good neighbor. So solar systems being as passive as they are, don't create noise, don't create smells, don't create vibration or any emissions. They're super passive and make a fantastic neighbor for all sorts of different applications. And actually, if you flip that around, they're also a very tolerant neighbor. So things like smell or noise that might be associated with certain types of industrial developments, or in this case, landfill operations, not a concern for solar. They don't mind. Now, that doesn't go for all impacts. Things like vibration or certain types of emissions would be something you'd want to look at to determine whether it had an impact before selecting a site. But in general, I think there's some two-way benefits to having solar as a neighbor. They work really well with others. So in this final slide on Shepherd, just wanted to show a snapshot, some drone photography of that expansion. So that first slide showed just the portion in the background there that was built first, with subsequent development extending the site further south. And that's one lesson learned, or item I would encourage attendees to think about, is opportunity for expansion. It's not rare for projects that we've been involved in to start small and grow. And solar is inherently a very modular technology. So there's, it doesn't tend to be technical limitations. It's having the forethought to understand how you can expand, build on the infrastructure you already have at the site to increase generation over time. The last thing I'll note here, just before moving on to the next case study, is municipalities are not exempt from the regulatory compliance requirements that every solar project is tagged with. So it's important for us on a small scale generation project like this to ensure we're meeting all those requirements. And in some cases, actually, municipalities have additional requirements they have to comply with, covering the generation of energy within their boundaries and ensuring that it's to offset their own uses. So just know that all the projects that you see driving around the city are all subject to those same regulatory requirements that were noted earlier. Second project I wanted to talk about you might have driven by and seen this one firsthand recently, located at the Telespark. It's the Renfrew Solar Garden project. And to the best of my knowledge, this is actually the second largest parking lot integrated solar system in Calgary, comprised of more than 2,000 solar panels and more than 500 linear meters of solar carport racking systems that will produce more than 1 million kilowatt hours annually. This was also a project delivered with support from the Alberta Municipal Solar Association, and it's doing some fantastic, it's coordinated with a solar co-op program, which, if you're interested, I would definitely recommend checking out the presentation that Heather alluded to coming up at BuildX, where they're going to explore some of that aspect of the project in detail. So this is what the site looks like roughly today. And I thought this was a really interesting one to bring because it represents something of a middle ground between rooftop solar and ground mounted solar. So the rooftop solar that actually the Telespark was already equipped with, you see on the building there. And solar carports, or solar over parking lots, is a really interesting middle ground because you're not taking away from the functionality of site functions, but it allows you to access space that doesn't require the infrastructure of a building underneath it. This is another aerial photo of the site. prior to the construction, but you'll be able to reflect that the solar installation essentially is blanketing over top of the parking lot, the majority of the parking lot there, front and center. And what I think is interesting is not so much where the solar panels are located, but what they're preserving. So as you look at this slide, it's probably obvious to you what has been avoided, and that's the wonderful green space, pathway systems, trail systems, and park space that surround this site. So by bringing the solar to the parking lot facilities, we'd be able to preserve all those natural areas and spaces for people to enjoy the outdoors from that development, which I thought was a fantastic, it's a fantastic benefit that applies to all parking lot developments. Now, one thing you'll also be able to see here is this site was also lucky to have some fantastic solar access. That won't always be the case with parking lots. So parking lots can be located in proximity to taller buildings where solar access will be something to consider. And while the shading from this building would be relatively minor, in your parking lot, it might be more significant. So be sure to check that when evaluating the feasibility of solar at parking lots. Another drone image from the other perspective. A couple things I do want to mention is when designing large solar systems like this, it's important to coordinate with vegetation. So that was actually a lesson learned that we took away from this project. We actually had to remove vegetation to bring these solar panels to the site because it had been put in locations along those those lines of parking without the anticipation of a future solar project coming on the site. And while solar and vegetation aren't mutually exclusive, you have to be cognizant of shading impacts and just space allowances for those two things when you're bringing them to the site together. I think this slide serves as a great reminder of the co-benefits of systems like this. Not only are you avoiding and preserving green space from development, you also have the co-benefits of providing shaded parking spaces. So you're providing a small amenity for folks using your site, which is an added benefit in a project like this. The last of the three case studies I wanted to talk about today is the NMAX Community Solar Fund. This is the one I'm really excited to be presenting to you today. This project or selection of small projects is really derived from a $5 million contribution from NMAX to support solar energy generation at community buildings across the city. We worked together with NMAX to find those sites, community association buildings and other community serving buildings that we could bring into this program, looking at a variety of things like solar potential, condition of the buildings, geographic distribution, and also looking at the Calgary Equity Index, so trying to bring investment into historically underserved communities within Calgary. So I think in my bio, it mentioned there were 25 sites. The list keeps growing. We're up to about 33 today as part of this program. And we're anticipating that upon conclusion, in aggregate, it will be more than 3 megawatts of solar capacity. I encourage you to check out calgary.ca/community solar if you're interested in learning a little bit more about this program. Now, this scale of development was a bit different than the previous two projects. So these sites are all roof-mounted systems and often on small buildings like you see on the screen here, community association buildings in various communities across the city. At this scale, for us, our first priority was looking at the condition of the building and its capacity to hold these panels. So this starts with electrical considerations. So from a regulatory perspective, you have to be able to match your solar systems to the consumption of the building under the microgeneration regulations. That was one thing we were looking at. We certainly had to look at the interconnection to the existing electrical equipment within the building. And there's that next layer of communication, as Heather kind of introduced, coordinating with the wire service provider to make sure that their upstream equipment serving the site had the capacity, was able to accommodate what we were planning on doing within the site. The electrical considerations is one piece. Structural is certainly another aspect. These are all existing buildings that we're working with, so evaluating the capacity of the structure was an important part. Um, this building, the Dover Community Center, is an interesting example. You know, all these roof surfaces look the same from the outside, but structurally underneath the main roof versus the lower shed roof versus the small outbuilding all have different structural systems sitting underneath them, and required kind of a close eye via a structural engineer to ensure that the solar systems could be accommodated. Um, You'll also see the smattering of mechanical equipment on the rooftop. I wanted to note that that's something that comes into play to understand, you know, how much capacity you have to bring solar to your roof. And also just as a kind of cautionary tale, obviously this building was designed and built long before solar was, you know, foreseen to be an option. But you can see the advantage of designing mechanical systems to preserve open roof space and that has good solar access. So, um, you know, the more you can do to free up that space, the simpler your solar installations will be. Although in the same breath, don't be discouraged if you're working in an existing building. Solar systems, as you can see here, are incredibly flexible to work around what you've got with some good design. So you can make it happen regardless of where your starting point is. And the third item I wanted to talk about is just, you know, solar access and optimizing where you're locating your solar on site. So this is the Ranchlands Community Association, which has a variety of different roofs sloping in different directions. And as part of that initial analysis, we were targeting those roofs that were going to give us the best bang for the buck. So this site is lucky to have some nice, flat, south-facing roof surfaces, but that was definitely part of the analysis and the selection of the right spot for the solar at sites across the city. Which leads me into one small plug I wanted to make on behalf of the City of Calgary, which is our residential solar calculator. So we actually, for the NMAX Community Solar Program, leverage the same data that's behind the residential solar calculator to evaluate feasibility and the solar opportunity at each site. But I would be remiss if I didn't share the fact that this capability is accessible to all residential solar, those interested in residential solar across the city. We have a public tool building on a fantastic data set of solar information that will help you determine, you know, which parts of your roof are best positioned for solar, what the recommended solar size would be, the environmental impacts of that, and even leading into financing options for those that want to bring solar to their site. You can use template typical building information, or you could even bring in your own specific buildings, historical energy use to get really accurate results on what that's going to look like in your case. So we essentially followed the same process for the NMAX Community Solar Program to find the buildings that had the best feasibility and then find the spots on those buildings where solar made the most sense. So that's available to anyone, calgary.ca/solar calculator. So that's all I have in terms of formal slides. I think I'm going to turn it back over to Megan. I'll stop sharing my screen here, turn it back over to Megan to bring us into the Q&A portion. And I look forward to questions and where the conversation goes from here.
Thank you, Heather and Adam. That was so great to hear from both of you. We do have a couple of questions popping up in the chat so far. I'm just gonna move them over to the screen so I can still see your faces. I think, I'm trying to see, the first one was someone asking if the Shepherd was built on a landfill site. And I feel like you touched on that, but I guess they want a little bit more specific.
Yeah, it is within the, I was looking into some of the history. It is within the landfill facility boundary. I was looking a little bit at historical air photos of the site. It's currently now adjacent to the Calgary compost facility. It had some interim uses as, believe it or not, racetracks in the vicinity. Also another spot where sometimes you develop brownfields through heavy vehicle use. But yes, it is within the Shepherd landfill site.
Perfect. And I'm trying to, they moved around on me while they got upvoted. are there any case studies you have on a utility scale, either probably either in Edmonton or Calgary that either of you know of?
We actually have a presentation coming up in November. I think I was just telling Adam about this before we started, but ATCO is coming to talk about their utility scale solar installation. That's also going to be in Calgary. I can't remember exactly where that one's located. Adam, do you happen to recall?
I've seen it, but I don't know off the top of my head. I forgot the location.
Yeah, it's also a
where-
brownfield site. I think it's near one of the highways. And so, yeah, I saw some photos of it. And Mackenzie, do you mind just writing in the chat when that webinar is going to be? I think it's November at some point, mid-November. But for utility scale brownfield examples, definitely tune in for that webinar. And anything else come to mind for you, Adam?
Just wanted to say that the installation at the Shepherd Solar Park, that's our biggest, and it still is under the small scale generation. So as a city, we've yet to go to the utility scale level, but not to say that it won't happen at some point in the future.
Well, yeah, I was noticing a number of First Nations who initially installed solar to offset their own usage locally are now investing in large solar power plants, large solar farms in southern Alberta. And so it's interesting to see that as soon as folks start adopting solar to offset their own utility costs near home, then they start thinking, hey, why don't we actually start using this as an income generator? So it'll be neat to see when some of the municipalities start doing that themselves and generate some of their own revenue to basically pad their budget going forward.
So Mackenzie's popped in the chat that November 17th is that next seminar. So feel free to tune in then. So another question was, to the point of brownfield locations and with the City of Calgary lead, I'm interested in knowing if C-train parking in areas above C-train lines has been considered. So this is an interesting question. I just saw like some picture on social media the other day that they had a bike lane in the middle of a highway that had solar on top of it. And again, I don't know whether this is just the internet creating things, but I'm wondering if that's sort of what they're thinking of.
Yeah, I'd say we're in a pretty kind of nascent place, and we've got some pilot projects out there demonstrating what could be possible. And I think Renfrew Solar Park is, again, showing another, or the Renfrew Solar Garden, excuse me, showing another application. I think the sky's really the limit. There aren't concrete plans that I know of as part of the C-train development, but we're showing that it's possible, and our transit-oriented developments and our park and ride locations, again, could be certainly prime spots to bring similar solar carport style designs. And that's a really interesting comment about over C-train lines. That's one that I'm sure there are some extra complications, but why not is my question. So it'd be interesting to see if that's something that could be done in the future.
Yeah, it reminds me of the notion of infrastructure corridors in general and integrating solar into all infrastructure corridors. Why don't we have solar arrays over top of all the pipelines running across the province? Why don't we have solar arrays running alongside all of our highways across? We need to start considering blending and building these things all together. So I think it's a really good question. I know there are discussions in northern Canada about making one large infrastructure corridor that would include transmission lines, pipelines, highways, Wi-Fi. And I was saying it should also include solar all along. And so it's interesting to think about that at the local level and what that can look like in our towns and cities as well.
Just one more note on that. Something that's really interesting about the C-train lines is, often when in terms of siting, you have to make sure you have capacity from the wire service provider to plug in, and also proximity to a load, someone that can use that energy. And a C-train is great, as an electric system. They're built out with a lot of capacity to provide power, and you've got a big power consumer in the C-train as well, or light rail transit in general. So I think that those both speak to some synergies there.
Absolutely.
Adam, you're getting really like geekily excited about this idea. You're like,
I know. Me too.
Let's go.
Let's do
go
it.
build some solar over the C train.
I like it.
That would be great.
We're finally expanding our LRT here in Edmonton, and I wish, we were thinking about that as well. Maybe there are some city planners in Edmonton thinking about that. Hopefully they are. It's easier to do probably when you're first building than it would be to add it all on after, as you've learned from parking lots.
All right. Another question is, can the city influence adding solar to flat top commercial buildings? When flying into the YYC airport, it is unfortunate to see all the rooftops, especially in the Northeast, without any current solar panels or green top roofs.
I can touch on that briefly. I know there are not very many commercial and solar incentives in place in Alberta right now. The City of Edmonton has a commercial clean energy improvement program where they're providing low interest financing for commercial arrays. I know Calgary is planning to roll out a residential clean energy improvement program, and that we'll be learning more about that at the Calgary Climate Symposium in late October. But Adam, do you happen to know if a SEEP in Calgary is going to be commercial inclusive?
I know that we're starting with residential, and then the program will grow from there. So yeah, as Heather mentioned, stay tuned to find out more about the residential version of that program, and then hopefully it can expand from there, or potentially it can expand from there. But residential will be first out the gate.
Yeah, and I know that last year, the Energy Savings and Business Program through Emissions Reduction Alberta was offering commercial incentives across Alberta. But unfortunately, when it came to solar PV, they were actually oversubscribed within a few short weeks. And so there's certainly demand there that we've seen that ERA had witnessed that demand. I do think they're still financing a number of energy efficiency upgrades for commercial, but they ran out of the solar PV funds. That funding came from Alberta's tier fund, their tier regulation. So basically the big oil and gas emitters, they pool their pollution money and then redistribute it to projects around the province. And so my hope is that the government of Alberta might see fit to give additional tier funds to the Energy Savings and Business Program for something such as additional commercial incentives. One of the big barriers, though, I've noticed for commercial solar is the microgeneration regulation, though, because as Adam was saying, the microgeneration regulation stipulates that you can only produce as much energy as you consume in the building. And so, of course, if there's no profit motive, it's very hard to convince commercial folks to do it. They're really profit oriented. So if we could remove, as Solar Alberta is working on a lobby to try and have the what we call the consumption cap removed from the microgen regulation, I think that would incentivize many commercial building owners to adopt solar, because if they could use it as a secondary income source in addition to the lease income, I think then we would have what we need for folks to start adopting solar without actually any financial incentives required. The financial incentive would be there in the ability to produce solar and sell it to the grid. So that's sort of my long-term hope for how we can address the commercial solar issue. But there is still commercial solar taking shape around the province. I would say some of the folks leading the charge on that are actually farmers. So it's very interesting to see the number of farms that are adopting solar if you're looking into commercial solar.
I'll just draw attention to the comment from Lewis, who's joining us as well. You mentioned that commercial clean energy improvement, or we're anticipating the clean energy improvement program to expand to commercial sites maybe as soon as 2024. So in the interim, within Calgary at least, lots of great information to get people over the knowledge gap of what it takes to do it. So check out calgary.ca/solar to better understand permitting requirements, those type of things, at least as a starting point.
Sounds good. And I also want to start hitting up your city council, see if we can't get some rebates going there too. But I know you can't present about that sort of stuff. Only I can. Anyways, so there's lots of possibilities. Good to hear you're heading that way with the SEEP program.
So I'm jumping to a different question, just because you started talking about solar farms. a question for Heather. A developer is looking into building a utility scale solar farm just north of Airdrie with some overlap over a wetland/pond, about 5 to 8% overlap. Are there mitigation measures the developer can take to minimize environmental impacts?
Well, of course, our recommendations would be that you not develop on the wetland. There are many developers, land developers and others who have developed extremely detailed methods of moving wetlands from here to there. So you could certainly consult with folks about that. I think what I would recommend is just checking in with some of our Solar Alberta consultants on our website. We have a directory, and if you go under the consultant section, some of them are very expert in utility farm developments, jumping through all the hoops. I know it can take 1 to 3 years just to get through the various regulatory approvals necessary for a utility scale development. Also 1 to 3 million, I hear, just to jump through those hoops before you even get to build. So I understand it is a fairly intense process. And yes, of course, land and transmission and water considerations are among those you have to jump through. So definitely get yourself an expert. And of course, if you're following our recommendations, we would suggest you avoid the wetland.
Okay. There was sort of a follow-up question to that, to the microgen utility scale question. Why does the consumption cap exist?
I was actually just talking about that yesterday. It's so interesting. I mean, Adam, you might know the history on this better than me, but so I think when microgen regs first came into play, which was well over 10 years ago, probably like 15 years now or so, there were a lot of fears at that time, like fears that solar and wind and things were going to somehow be detrimental to the distribution and transmission systems. We have since learned that that's absolutely not the case. If anything, solar actually reduces the cost for ratepayers in general for distribution and transmission. Because you're producing your own on site, so it actually reduces the infrastructure needs to service your site, and so it also lowers the daytime peaks for demand in Alberta when it comes to electricity, because again, you're producing your own, so you're not actually putting extra demand on the grid often. So there are lots of benefits to having solar on the grid in Alberta. And I think now that those have been fully realized and people are recognizing that solar is not a drain on our distribution and transmission system, now's the time to revisit a lot of those regulations. They're kind of archaic, they're out of date. We saw the government of Alberta this spring put through Bill 22, where they said, industrial sites can now do unlimited self-supply and storage, as well as unlimited export to the grid. And so, the government of Alberta has decided they're no longer scared of that when it comes to industrial sites. We just have to overcome that fear at the residential and business level now, and I think we're well on our way to doing that. At least that's our hope. Any additional thoughts though on why that might have been in place, Adam? Was it just the fear factor, or do you think there was anything else at play?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. That was a great overview, Heather, of kind of the history and what's likely, where it came from at the start. But yeah, looking forward to, obviously more flexibility. It just creates more opportunities for different types of solar installations and people with different motivations to come to the table and make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say internationally, people have gotten over this. Like I have volunteers who volunteer. They have properties in India and they also have properties in Alberta. And they're just so surprised how behind the times we are, because of course in India, they are able to produce at the residential and commercial level for profit. And they can produce in excess of what they are consuming on site. At least that's what my volunteers have told me. And so they're really confused. It's not just Alberta that's behind, actually. Every province in Canada is. If Alberta does lift the cap on microgenerators, we would be the first in the country to do so. So I hope we follow in the footsteps of many of our the other countries around the world and consider, I guess, going whole hog on microgenerating in Alberta.
Yeah, I was chatting with somebody who came by the booth when we were at when Solar Alberta was at the environmental vehicle or the electrical vehicles expo on the weekend, and he was saying the same thing. Like, why can we do this in Germany, but we, why can't I make money off of my solar panels here? And I'm like, well,
I think it's partially because Canadians are too polite, right? Oh, like,
Sorry, Adam.
oh, we can't. Okay.
One thing to note is that that cap exists under the microgeneration regulation, which is kind of a streamlined pathway to make solar happen. There are other, when you look at small scale generation or just large utility scale, that cap doesn't exist. So there are other ways for different, if you're in that, as one of the Q&A comments says, merchant solar, you're producing utility.
You can get around it.
Not under the.
Well, that's a good point, Adam. You can get around it. That was the intent of the small scale generation. Like I was chatting with the Alberta Energy the other day about this, because I like to harass them a lot, and they were saying, if folks want to produce for profit at a smaller scale, just use the small scale generation regulation. I argue that is burdensome, and that micro generation regs are much easier to work within. And I think that was really the other piece of the puzzle, Adam, you mentioned. It's quick and easy. So if you want to do a microgen installation and you want to jump through the hoops involved in that, you're looking at a couple months to get through those hoops. If you want to do a larger installation and you want to start putting more power on the grid, you are looking at, as the question earlier alluded to, probably more like years to jump through all the hoops just to make sure that everybody can handle what you're producing. There have been instances, I think there was a commercial generation initiative. They were trying to do 2 megawatts in southern Alberta and Fortis territory. And Fortis had to say no go because they actually didn't have the transmission infrastructure to even accommodate that energy that they wanted to give them. So there are ultimately some limitations to our system still. I hope our province builds out our transmission infrastructure in a more robust way so that we can give them all the power that we desire to give them. But right now, depending where you are in the province, that could be a barrier. That said, I do think there are other mechanisms we can use to say no, just as we saw Fortis was able to use it. They were able to say no, and when they couldn't accommodate it. So I don't think we need to have that in the microgen regulation. I think there's lots of tools and techniques now to adjust if a system size is going to be too big for the transmission system.
So do we think we've sort of answered any limitations for merchant solar like the one in Innisfail, or do you guys have any more follow-up?
Oh, I didn't read that question. Innisfail. I love Innisfail.
We kind of touched on it, giving the landscape of regulation that comes into play.
What was the exact question, if you don't mind me asking?
It just said any limitations for merchant solar like the one in Innisfail.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we do have a webinar on that one, actually, which is pretty cool. So my understanding is if you're doing a large utility scale solar farm, you can decide, are you doing a power purchase agreement or are you doing merchant? If you do merchant, the limitation is, my understanding is it's up to your risk tolerance. Basically, Innisfail went merchant. I don't know how that's going for them. I'm curious. We'll have to find out. It wasn't Innisfail, I should say. Innisfail leased some land to a developer who went with a merchant system. So there's actually a developer doing that. Innisfail just did the land lease. And so, so that's a very interesting question. I don't know of any limitations. I think it's up to the power producer to decide whether they're going to take the risk and go merchant, or if they're going to get themselves a power purchase agreement. We are going to be learning more about power purchase agreements at our webinar in November as well. Business Renewable Canada will be coming to co-present with ATCO, and they're going to talk us through power purchase agreements. But now you've made me wonder if we need to have a whole other session on merchant systems. So we'll have to think about that for the future. Have you guys done any interaction with the merchant system, Adam? Not really, hey, because you're not doing solar farms yet? Okay, that'll be next year for Calgary. Once you've got your first City of Calgary solar farm, we'll see what you guys opt for. Are you going to go PPA or merchant?
Tell Mackenzie to put that on the list of upcoming seminars.
Yeah.
So question for Adam, what were the major challenges faced by community associations interested in solar as part of the NMAX Community Solar Fund? Were they structural, electrical? What percent of this is getting detailed, what percent of submitted projects have been rejected due to those challenges? This individual is from the city of Airdrie, so I think they are.
Yeah. No, great question.
Vested interest.
Yeah, I don't have the specific percentages, but I give you a rough idea of how it played out. out of all the community associations that expressed an interest to join into the program, I'd say we're running, over half met all the criteria. So structural, electrical. The big one, to be honest, that knocked people off the list, at least for the time being, is the roof age. So when you're dealing with existing buildings, you ideally want to time it so that you've got a good amount of life left in your roof when you're putting up solar, because all that solar will add to the cost of roof replacement, and they'll have to come off and then back on again when you get to roof replacement. So our criteria was we needed at least 10 years of life left in the roof membrane. And that was the criteria that caught up the most projects. The good news is that, 5 years down the road, when they do their next roof replacement, they're probably a great candidate for solar. There were relatively few at the community association scale that were not meeting structural requirements. I think due to the nature of sloped roof design, there's inherent capacity in there, and there's less loads put on the top of a building with a flush mount system like that. When you get into flat roofs, structural is more often a question that will trip you up. But most of our sites were sloped. I think all 3 examples that I showed you there were pitched roofs. So overall, about a little over half made it through all the criteria, which I think is impressive, because these are, in all cases, buildings that were never designed with this in mind. So it speaks to the pretty widespread potential to bring solar to existing buildings. But certainly we saw some fallout on account of structural, a lot fallout on account of roof membranes, and a few for shading, obvious reasons. There's some beautiful trees in the area that we just couldn't part with, didn't want to part with, and that would compromise the potential of the system.
I think some of the installers almost enjoy a challenge, right? If they get a building and they're like, okay, how are we going to make this work? So they must have had some fun making some of those ones work. I have to say, I was just pitching the City of Edmonton yesterday on a permanent clean energy improvement program, because they're only piloting theirs at this stage, unlike Calgary, who's rolling out a fulsome program. And so it does sound like they're moving ahead with a permanent program. And I was saying to them, your pilot program included roof and electrical in part. You could pay a little bit for the roof upgrade and the electrical upgrade, but not enough. And I was encouraging them to see that as part of the solar array, especially the roof, because really, as you're explaining, the roof is the mounting system. I mean, the roof, you are mounting it on the roof. You don't have to pay for screws, and you don't have to pay, like, you do need screws, but you don't need to have the whole mounting system that you would on one of your solar farms, because you're using the roof. And so I'm really hoping that as more commercial and residential clean energy improvement programs roll out, I'm really hoping they'll tuck the roof in as sort of part and parcel with the solar PV, because so often I hear from installers who are held up by that issue, especially, sadly, for lower income homeowners. And that's really sad when you really want to make sure you're addressing that energy poverty issue. And if you can't reduce someone's energy bills who's living in poverty because their roof is inadequate, that's pretty heartbreaking. So hopefully Calgary is also considering roofing as part of their commercial SEEP program in 2024. And hopefully the City of Edmonton expands that as well. Airdrie and others, I think, are moving on SEEP too, if I'm not mistaken. So definitely something for all municipalities across Alberta to consider is, imagine the roof as the mount and keep it, part and parcel for those incentive and funding programs. Interesting to hear what it looks like on the ground, Adam. Thank you for sharing.
All right. As solar panels become more efficient, they will likely be replaced by more advanced solar tech. Was that included in the case study's economics? Can old panels be recycled? Does that all make sense?
So maybe I could talk. Can I talk, Heather, about the economic view that we take, and
I'd like that.
Chime in on the future for some of this equipment that we're putting up on roofs. In our cases, all our case studies are, looking at the technology that we're installing and assuming kind of running it out to the end of life, ensuring that we've got the economics making sense, looking at what we have today. Recognize that technology can change, and I think if and when it does, especially if there was a major step up in terms of efficiency, we would look at replacement of existing systems, either midstream or at end of life, we rerun the economic analysis, and I think we'd have to make sense economically to replace something that could still produce with something better. But I wouldn't want to presume that that's not going to happen, because we've just seen so much development in solar technology and affordability of different solar technologies for my career. So you never know what the future would hold, but we haven't assumed anything. We were not counting on the technology improving to make these things work. Kind of work with what we're building, and then if things get better, we would take a look at the case that on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I think you made some good points there. I mean, most people are kind of want the biggest bang for their buck if they're gonna invest in solar. They're not necessarily going the recycled solar PV route, but part of that is also because there isn't a huge secondary market yet for solar PV. The US is developing one. There's kind of like a Craigslist for solar down there. It's not actually Craigslist, but they have that secondary market for reuse of solar PV. We're developing that in Alberta. Actually, the Alberta Recycling Management Authority is currently working with NATE to start the process of testing solar panels here in Alberta, determining whether there's still some life left in them, and then trying to figure out what they're going to do from there. They're either going to be looking at resale options or reuse options, or they're going to be recycling them. 95% of a solar panel is recyclable, I believe, is what I read. And so there's absolutely potential to recycle the vast majority of it. However, solar panels, like even when part of it's broken, because as Adam was saying, there's such a modular thing. Even if a couple modules are broken on the panel, as you see behind Megan in the picture, the rest of the array can actually still be working fine. And so it's really interesting how they often can last very long, that most of them are warranted for 25 years. They're rumored to last quite well for 40. And I think Gordon Howell, one of our original members who's still with us today, he actually put an array up in the 70s that he's quite sure would still work today. However, I think he had some issues with technology changing in terms of the connection to the grid. So but the panels themselves, he's pretty sure are still a go. So definitely need to explore the opportunities for reuse. I was saying that, if we're doing solar along Highway 2, what a great opportunity to reuse solar panels, older panels, but there's not a lot yet, right? So there aren't a lot of solar panels that are actually even ready for reuse or recycling in Alberta. There will be a lot in maybe 25 to 30 years. So we have to prepare for that and start planning, but it's not actually a pressing issue yet. Oh, we're going to have an update, actually. So 2 years ago at the solar show, we had a panel on solar PV recycling. And ARMA, the Alberta Recycling Management Authority, is coming back to the solar show February 6th to 10th in 2023 to give us an update. And they're going to also include the information about how their reuse plan is going as well. So definitely join us for that if you're interested in solar PV reuse or recycling.
Okay, we have two questions about lights, so I'll sort of compile them into one. So one of the questions is, with all of the road intersections in the city, all of the cities which already have lighting, has it been considered to install solar there? And the second part of that question, well, another question is, did you have to install additional lighting for the car park after installing the panels? So light related.
Maybe I'll answer them in reverse. So yeah, it's a great point with respect to the lighting at the Renfrew Solar Garden. I should have mentioned that alongside with planting vegetation, because the parking lot lighting systems did have to be redesigned as part of this project. So you no longer have the tall mast mounted ones that hit wide areas with really bright lights. It's the lighting is integrated into the solar carport pieces. So something to think about if you're anticipating for future solar at a site. With respect to lighting, solar serving distributed lighting systems, that's an interesting one. I think once you've got traffic lights or street lights set up and serviced, the main costs have already been incurred. Where it would be really interesting is when you're going into places that don't currently have electrical service, and perhaps there's capital cost savings of avoiding, bringing the wires out to the sites. However, I would note in a system like that, if it's not connected to the grid, it would not only require solar, but also some way to store solar, so batteries as well. So there'd be some capital cost challenges, or at least considerations when making that call.
Yeah, maybe something to consider once the cost of storage has come down some more. I think the cost of storage will follow in the path and the footsteps of solar PV and hopefully become more and more affordable over time. But yeah, I would hate to rely on that particular solar powered light in December when we actually have only a couple hours of light in the day, because it wouldn't be very reliable. I made the mistake of buying those solar Christmas lights, forgetting that of course these would have been designed in a southern environment. So we just do Christmas in July every year because of these lights that actually light up best in the summer here. So anyways, yeah, we definitely need that grid connect for the reliability purposes. So good point there, Adam.
No, that makes sense. All right, we've got about 4 minutes left until we switch to our Zoom, to our other Zoom meeting. So I'm just going to go with one last question. Is there an opportunity for municipalities to sign agreements with potential solar power producers, dramatically advancing the installations, thinking city parking lots, etc.? The city provides the space, the organization provides the investment installation with shared benefits. So is there an opportunity for such?
Yeah, I'd say definitely. And I think when it comes to our, big picture energy supply strategy, looking at all options for greening our energy supply, they're all on the table, be it kind of medium scale, as the person asking the question is describing, within the city at sites, up to utility scale in locations outside of the city, that are optimized for solar. It's all on the table, and I think that's something that strategically we're putting, we're reckoning with right now, is what's the right mix, what are the pros and cons of different strategies for essentially supplying City of Calgary, the corporation supplying our energy needs from renewable sources. I think the reality is it's going to be a mix. We're probably going to continue to some extent with what we've done historically, and coming up with big picture agreements to source green power, or through power purchase agreements to meet some of our needs. And we're certainly going to support that. We have a lot of systems already on the ground, some of which you've seen today, connecting indirectly to our facilities. So I think it's going to be some type of mix of those, looking at the pros and cons of the different types of installation.
That's a really good point, Adam. I mean, there's so many different ways to participate in the solar sector, right? Like I often, rebates and incentives aside, there are really, in my mind, 4 ways that a municipality could really bolster the solar sector in a meaningful way. And it all, in my mind, depends on how risk averse they are, right? So you could take the path that Innisfail took. If you want the lowest risk support for solar, lease a solar developer some land. You get a little bit of lease money every year. They get some affordable land. It's a beautiful synergy. Everyone contributes to climate mitigation. If you want a slightly higher risk, go for the power purchase agreement, as you're talking about. Be the purchaser, buy the green energy, give someone the assurances they need to make their farm happen. That's probably still really low risk. You're probably going to get a really good deal, actually, because solar power is super cheap. Or if you want to take a slightly higher risk approach, do what the City of Calgary is doing and actually develop some solar arrays of your own to offset some of your own utility bills, or go all the way, as some of the First Nations are doing in Northern Alberta. I know St. Albert was cautiously considering this and they've backed off recently, but there's no reason that a municipality couldn't actually create a solar farm and develop solar energy for revenue and use that to, you could put that revenue into anything. And so there's so many different options depending on how much risk your municipality is willing to take, from very low to minimal risk to higher risk if you want to do some income generating. So lots to consider, and it's neat to see the City of Calgary pushing the envelope on a lot of these topics.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. So that's probably about all the time we have for questions today. I think Mackenzie's going to pop one last poll up so we can just get a sense of how much you enjoyed the seminar today, because I'm sure everybody did. I'm sure I did. And then we are, it tells me I can't vote. So unfortunately, everybody else is going to have to tell us how much they enjoyed it. And then also in the chat, you will find the link to the other, to our sort of more informal Zoom meeting room where people can turn off their cameras and turn on their cameras and have a little bit of a more informal discussion. So thank you very much, both Heather and Adam today. And thank you to everybody who participated. And thanks, Lewis, for being here to answer a couple of questions